How do we learn with multimedia? In other words, with more than one medium, whether it be with text and pictures, or with animations or videos. And therefore, how should we teach? That's what we're going to look at in this movie. First, we're going to look at a theory of learning. And as a consequence of that, how therefore should we teach to be in line with that? According to this model of learning, we have three kinds of memory: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. What happens is we get inputs through our five senses. Those inputs, they are enormous, an enormous number of inputs every single second through our various senses. And we cannot pay attention to all of that. So fortunately, we're able to filter out only those few that we pay attention to. So sensory memory is extremely large but very transient. From that, we filter out, we pass a few things along into our working memory. Now, in this discussion, working memory is going to be the star, because working memory is where learning happens. So if we can understand how working memory operates, then we can better understand how to teach in a way that is consistent with how our learners learn. Now, to keep things in working memory, we have to rehearse them, and that's because one of the traits of working memory is that it's so very small. Either we have to rehearse them, like if we're given a list of numbers and we keep saying them until we can write them, or we have to encode that information into our long-term memory. In other words, we need to store it. And we can also retrieve things from our long-term memory into our working memory. Working memory refers to what we are thinking about at any one moment. So if you're familiar with computer memory, working memory is like the RAM. RAM allows you to open a lot of applications at one time if you have a high RAM. Whereas the long-term memory is like the ROM, the hard drive space. That allows you to store stuff. One of the big differences between computers and humans is where the limitation lies. In humans, the limitation lies in the size of working memory, RAM, how much we can think of at once. A computer can have many, many, many applications on at once. We can have very few. Whereas a computer's limitation lies in its long-term memory relative to humans, because although we get very big computers nowadays, a few terabytes, that is minuscule in comparison to the human's long-term memory size, which some people say is infinite. But we're not going to focus so much about long-term memory today. We're going to focus on working memory. Now, before we get on to the characteristics of working memory, let's just liken what I've just said to this analogy here, a carpenter. So the carpenter is like a person who is learning. Just like the carpenter has a job to do, let's say he has to build a chair. In a similar way, the learner has a job they've got to do. They have to learn certain content, certain material. How does the carpenter build that chair? How does the learner learn that material? Well, the carpenter needs material to build it from. Where does he get that material from? He might get some from the outside, just as the child might get some information from outside, hearing it from you as you speak, seeing some things that you show while you're speaking. And the material can also come from the shelves of the carpenter. The child can also recall some information from their past, what they learnt in the past, they experienced in the past, from the long-term memory. Those things, the materials, must be brought simultaneously to the carpenter's workbench for the carpenter to be able to make this chair. Similarly, the child has to think about the things that the teacher said and shown, and think about the things that are necessary to make this learning happen from their long-term memory simultaneously in their working memory for that learning to happen. Well, we could go on with the analogy about the carpenter knowing how to position individual pieces and the tools they use. There's actually a lot one can get out of the analogy. But for now, let's move on and speak about the characteristics of working memory. The first thing to understand is that it is very limited in capacity. Actually, that picture of the carpenter's bench, that carpenter's bench should have even been smaller because we can really think of very little at once. That's if we're novices, if we're new to the topic. Once we become experts in a field, well then the rules change a bit, but I'm not going to focus on that now because we're speaking about how we should teach learners who are novices, like school level learners maybe. So there's very limited capacity, and if you try to put too much on that bench, the child feels discomfort. We call it cognitive overload. In a similar way, things fall off the bench. The next thing is that, very interestingly, there are two channels in working memory, one for sounds and text, the other one for pictures. So in this analogy, there's actually a discrepancy with how we learn because this only shows one working bench. But in our working memories, there are two working benches. But unfortunately, you can't just add stuff that comes into the one that still has space because one of those benches can only take pictures and the other one can take text or auditory sounds. And then the last point is that you have to actually have active processing in learning. Like the carpenter actually has to build the chair. Unfortunately, we don't get internet downloads for our learners. And now let's unpack that active processing a bit. There are three kinds of active processing. One is distractions. The next one is selecting out what's important. And the last one is sense making. So similarly to the carpenter, he can be distracted. He can do nonsense stuff. He can, waste his time by connecting things that are irrelevant or being busy with putting things on his bench, which have nothing to do with the chair. So distractions, that has nothing to do with the targeted learning. And so we as teachers need to try and minimize those. And then selection. So the carpenter needs to select out the relevant pieces for making this particular item. And then sense making, the carpenter needs to then join those relevant pieces in an appropriate way, organize them and integrate them, join them. Similarly, the learner needs to select which pieces of information are relevant for this particular thing that I've got to learn. What's more relevant than others? What's the hierarchy of information? And how are they arranged relative to one another? How do you make sense? How do you organize them? And how should they be joined, integrated? We've now spoken about how we learn. Let's move on to, therefore, how should we teach? This is a very highly researched area. People have done hundreds of research projects about this and collected a lot of data and written a lot of publications and come up with this list. I've actually already simplified this list. And each of those you can go and find lots and lots of research studies with a lot of data supporting it and explaining it. But I am simply going to focus on these 5 things that I would like to bring across as strongly as I can, even though there's more to this theory and these principles about presentation than what I'm going to focus on now. So what are these 5? Let me just name them first and then I'm going to unpack each of them. We need to keep it as simple as possible. We need to highlight key points and use pictures as well as keywords. We need to speak, not read, and we need to segment, divide up our presentations. So let's take a bad example to start with. Let's pretend I am giving you a presentation about properties of metals, and this is how I'm doing it. Properties of metals. Metals are found on the left-hand side of the periodic table of the elements. Metals are shiny. Metals are flexible, meaning they can be bent without breaking. Metals are good electrical conductors. I hope that you can see that this is a bad presentation. I would suggest to you should pause and you should unpack as many things as you can about why that was bad. I hope you said the background is too busy. It's distracting. It's got nothing to do with what we're busy speaking about, so why make it so distracting? Next, can you see there's inconsistency? Inconsistency in use of bullets or not, in the size of font, in the way in which I've highlighted stuff, and then I haven't highlighted some of the stuff. It's just too much and it's boring. The way that I was reading it was also boring. There are full sentences which is just also unnecessary for a presentation. You must adjust your resources so they fit for purpose. What else is bad about this? These awful animations. What was the point of that? Why should I have this bouncing thing here? You would maybe say, to make it more interesting, the interest must come from the content, not from irrelevant flashy things which just distract. So, first step, well, this improves it. It's still not good, but let's get the distraction away. It's a little bit better now. Another thing, let's get rid of the full sentences. Look how much that is improved. You can say those full sentences as you speak. Our PowerPoints, our presentations should be built for the learner to learn better, not as a crutch to help us remember what to say. We should understand this work so well that we don't need to read a full sentence from the PowerPoint. We know it. The purpose of this is just to give the spelling maybe for learners who don't know how to spell it, and just a support for what we're saying. So this is a bit better. It's still not very good, but we're getting to something a bit better a little bit later. So first point is keep it simple. Why should we keep it simple? Because working memory, where learning happens, has limited capacity. Now, of course, if they're reading, then it can't just be keywords because it's still got to be understandable. We are there to explain with what we're saying, but when they're reading their textbook, we are not there to explain, so the textbook must explain it. But we are now speaking about a multimedia presentation. When they've got their textbook, that is a single medium, a text-based medium that's explaining it. There's very limited capacity. They can only attend to a few things at once. You must be part of that. You must be explaining it. They should be attending to you as well, and your visual part of the multimedia, your PowerPoint. It can't add so much load that they cannot hear you and hear what you are saying, and they cannot get what is meant to be got from your presentation either. We need to be aware of the limited capacity of our learners' working memory, and that's why we need to keep it simple. Also, the active processing aspect. The distractions like bouncing and flying and zooming, whatever, animations that have nothing to do with the content, that takes up some of the processing power of your learners. They're busy processing that, but that is not helping towards building this particular chair, this particular learning. It's got to do with something else, the same with the distracting background. So we need to minimize distractions and keep the focus on the actual content. Next point, we need to highlight key points. Now, how can we do that? It doesn't necessarily mean we need to use the highlighter tool. That can look quite ugly. But using a different color, for example, like this. And then when we speak, we really stress that. So we highlight also with our voice. We can also use something like this. And here I'm using animations. This is a single slide, but I'm using animations not in a distracting way, but in order to gradually reveal the information so that there's not too much at once. So they're found on the left-hand side, they're shiny, they're flexible, and they're good conductors of electricity. So you can see that by building it up step by step, each time we're only adding a little bit new stuff, and so not contributing to cognitive load. So why must we do that? As I've said, because of the limited capacity of our learners' working memory, and also we must help them to select the right information to focus on. What else must we do? We must use pictures and keywords. Don't forget about the pictures. For example, we could say, metals are found on the left-hand side, and there we have a picture demonstrating that. They're shiny. They're flexible, we can see there, and I would hope that you would also have a metal there and show the flexibility at the same time. And they're good conductors of electricity, and there you could actually have a little circuit with a bulb and then break the circuit and put the metal in the gap and then see, the bulb shines. You see, these are some examples of bold use of a few words with pictures to support it. That's what copper looks like. And then we could speak about the characteristics of copper. It's a reddish-brown metal that's shiny. Iron, you get it in different forms. One is steel wool. And there we can give the symbols. Why should we do this? Because working memory has two channels. One is for pictures, one is dedicated to pictures. And if you just have a lot of text on your slides and on top of it you're busy speaking, then you are only using the one channel, not the other channel. You're only using one of the two channels, the one that is for text, which is both verbal and written text. And that one is getting overloaded. Meanwhile, the visual one, the picture-based one, is going to waste. So use pictures. Obviously, don't only use pictures, because if you do that, then the other one is going to waste. But generally, it's the picture one that we underuse. We don't use to maximum capacity. So here are some examples. So you can see here, I'm just using pictures. And then I would speak and I would say, for example, okay, here we have two different kinds of mixtures. Say we're having a party and we've got some sweets, a mixture of sweets, and then we mix up some cool drink. So both of them are mixtures, but they're quite different. In what way are they similar and what way are they different? And then I can ask the learners to tell me. And then hopefully they will say they're similar in that they both mixtures. In other words, they're made of two or more different things put together. In what way are they different? And I would obviously lead them, prompt them back and forth, and we would have a dialogue to construct this together. So in what way are they different? And hopefully someone would say, well, with the sweets, we can clearly see the individual kinds of sweets. So we could go and actually hand sort them. Whereas with the drink, you cannot, once they've mixed together, we can't see a clump of the Kool-Aid and a clump of the water. They've properly integrated, and so it wouldn't be so easy to go and separate it. So you can see there's the verbal, we're speaking about multimedia, there's the verbal medium of you speaking and undergoing dialogue, and then there's the visual medium of seeing this using the pictures. We're not using text in this particular example. We are using both of the channels of the learner's working memory. The text-based one is taken up by our verbal speaking, and then the pictorial one is taken up by these pictures. And they complement one another. And then we can bring in another picture, speak about the submicroscopic level of this, explaining why, in the case of the drink, we can't see clumps of Kool-Aid and clumps of water because the submicroscopic particles are properly divided and integrated and mixed, whereas that's not the case with a suite. So then we bring in another kind of representation. Then we can bring in some written text and give the terms. But the explanation didn't come from lots and lots of bullet points of text, which would be, number one, very boring, and number two, would overload the text-based side of working memory. Next point, we need to speak, not read, when we're using something like PowerPoint. This is something which many teachers and academics really need to understand. Why is it that we should speak, not read our many bullet points on our slideshow, which is bad teaching? Well, 2 points. Limited capacity of our working memory or our learners' working memory, and the fact that the way that they learn is they have to process it themselves. Just you reading it doesn't make them know it. So let's first speak about the limited capacity. There is so little space anyway in their working memory. Why would they choose to fill their working memory with that boring stuff? There's so much more interesting stuff that they could think about. And then what about the active processing? In order to help them to actually make sense of what you're saying. In other words, in the analogy with the carpenter, to know how to position the individual pieces of knowledge that you're giving them and that is sparking them to recall from their long-term memory. In order for them to know how to position those things relative to one another and how to join them with one another. In other words, how to make sense. You need to speak, and as you speak, you help them make sense because you stress appropriate things, and especially if you're actually visually present with them, you use hand gestures, facial expressions, all those things which come with natural speaking, which tend to get lost with reading, and those give cues of how they should orientate the various things with one another so that they can make sense and give them motivation, because it adds interest, to do that very difficult process. Sense-making is an incredibly difficult process. And so it needs to be interesting enough to have the motivation to engage in it. And boring reading is not going to give that motivation. Lastly, let's look at segmenting. So we need to break it up. How have I done that here? I've signposted. There were 2 main things that I was going to speak about, and then I went on and subdivided and so on. So this can be a useful way when you start off your lesson. You give the signposts of where you're heading so that it's divided into chunks. Why do we need to segment our presentations? Well, again, because of the limited capacity. So we deal with one thing at a time so that we know, okay, now I'm just focusing on this one thing. Because of our limited capacity, we need to focus on one thing at a time. And then also the active processing part of our working memory. What is the good part of the active processing? It's selection and sense making. We don't want the distractions. We're trying to get rid of that. But the segmentation is particularly relevant to these 2 good parts. When we segment, we focus on one thing at a time. It helps the learner to know what to select. Right now, what are we focusing on? What are we selecting? And then, how can we then make sense of just that one thing? Also, when we give the segmentation at the beginning, we give the overview, then it helps to see the big picture and then to know how each part fits into the big picture. And that helps with organizing, in other words, sense-making, organizing and integrating. So, in summary, I've picked out 5 important principles of multimedia presentation. They're certainly not the only ones, but they're the 5 that I particularly find important. We must keep it simple. Why? Because working memory is so small. You must make sure that you fill it only with that which you're trying to really get across, and make sure that distractions are not included there. We must highlight key points. Why? To help the learners in the active processing they need to do, which is, in other words, learning, to know what to select out. We must use pictures and keywords. Why? Because we have these two channels in our very small working memory, and one is dedicated only to pictures. And so we must make sure we don't let that one go to waste. The other one is to words. Now, of course, we're going to speak, and so a lot of that one is going to be filled by our speech, because speech and text occupies the same channel. And so, because already a lot of it is taken up by our speech, make sure that you don't overload it also with text. We must speak, not read. Why? Because that's much more interesting, and that gives the motivation to represent what we're saying in working memory rather than other things occupying working memory, like what they're going to have for lunch. And so that they have the motivation to do the very difficult thing of active processing, sense-making, selecting and sense-making. And also because when you speak, you naturally highlight the things which they should select, and you naturally signpost how they should integrate. And so it helps with the good parts of active processing. The good parts meaning those which contribute towards learning. And then we should segment, break up your speaking. And remember that, in fact, the literature on this, the research on this is extensive. And you should go and read it if you're really interested in knowing better how to teach or researching this. And this is a more comprehensive list, and there's a lot of literature on each of these points, and some of them you'll see I haven't spoken about. And this, by the way, is a very bad slide if you're going to use it to teach. If I actually expected you to read it, but I'm not showing it to expect you to read right now. I'm giving it to you so that you could, at the end of this movie, use it as a resource yourself to get some more ideas of what you could further read and what you could also focus on as you are making your PowerPoints.